Today we're talking about dealing with one of the many different kinds of defaults that a tenant might perform under your residential lease. One of the specific problems a lot of landlords have is when a tenant fails to grant access. In other words, the lease says the landlord or the manager has the right to enter the property with certain notice. That lease is a civil contract and it's enforced in a civil court. And for the tenant not to comply with the contract, that might be a default. And if the tenant's in default and refuses to correct the default, then the landlord might declare that the lease is going to be terminated as of a certain time. And then the landlord is going to evict the tenant based on holding over beyond the termination of the lease. What a lot of landlords don't understand is that while all of that is civil, many landlords think, I'm the owner of the property, I have keys, I'm going to go in when I want to. Well, that's called criminal trespass. So if you have a tenant that is not letting you in the property, that is reason to be concerned. When we're managing a property and a tenant won't let us in, and one of their excuses for that is, I just don't want anybody in my home. Well, that's fine. It may be your home, but it is not your house. And for all we know, you're cooking meth in the property, you're growing marijuana in the property, you're running a puppy mill in the property. You know, the tenant may be highly offended by that, but our explanation is, since you won't let us in, we don't know. And since most tenants do let us in, we figure there's a very significant reason why you won't let us in the property. The second part of that is we have in our lease a penalty that the tenant's going to be charged every time the tenant refuses to grant access. So if we set up a time to go see the property and the tenant agrees and then they stand us up, there's a fee for that. If we set up a time to see the property and the tenant is silent on it and we go to the property, there's a fee for that. So we can influence them financially to comply with the lease. But what the owners need to understand is when the tenant says, no, you cannot come in the property, that means no. To go into the property when the tenant says not to could turn into you being put in handcuffs and put in the back of a police car. So remember that this is a civil issue and it needs to be dealt with in civil court. And you can create a lease, as we have done, that has penalties in place for when this happens. Now, a second part of this is Excalibur managing your property? If the tenant fails to grant access, if the tenant is charged a fee for that, who's going to get that fee? Well, often it happens because there's a maintenance issue and a maintenance contractor needs to access the property in order to make the repair. The tenant agrees to a date and time to let the contractor in. The tenant stands the contractor up and the contractor generates a service call invoice for the owner. In those circumstances, Excalibur is going to pay the fee that's paid by the tenant to the owner because the owner is the one that suffered in this circumstance. In other instances, Excalibur is sending an inspector out to check the property. And when the inspector goes out and the tenant won't let them into the property, then it is Excalibur who has been harmed. And in those instances, Excalibur is going to get the fee paid by the tenant for failure to grant access. So that's all in accordance with our aligned interest fee structure. If the owner's being harmed, the owner's going to get the fee. If the manager's being harmed, the manager's going to get the fee. But the primary point of this message is to understand that all of this is dealt with on a civil contract, and do not try and force your way into a property when the tenant says don't come in, because that's a criminal act and you don't want to be locked up for trying to access your property when the tenant said don't come in.